Hey
Oh,
everybody, my name is Jim Farmer. I'm the festival director of Out on Film. Thanks for joining us this year. This is our 34th year of bringing you films for, by, and about our community and its allies. This is, however, our first year as a hybrid festival. We are doing both a limited number of screenings in cinema and a whole lot more virtually. And one of the great films that we have that is part of our virtual catalog is The Fandom. I'm going to read a brief description of the film, and then we're going to reach out. We're going to talk to the filmmakers. So thanks so much. The Fandom dives headfirst into the imaginative world of furries, fans of the anthropomorphic arts. Sorry about that. Using archival footage, this documentary traces the history of the fandom from its roots in the 1970s to the global community it is today. So I am very delighted to have the director of the film, Ash Kreis, and I'm also lucky to have the producer of the film, Phil Kreis. Thanks so much for joining us.
hey, you're welcome.
We watched this film and we're really, really captivated and entertained by it. But just tell me a little bit about how this came up.
Oh, so this was actually a conversation that really happened between my husband and I. Phil showed me this picture
Mhm.
in an article. It was a black and white photo of a fursuit, which is a furry costume,
Yeah.
and a couple guys standing in like this 1970s office, and I was like, wow, that's very unique.
Extremely vintage.
Extremely vintage, and it was surprising to me that this community had existed that long, and so we just started kind of diving into the history of it.
Right. Yeah. I had met some people that were part of the original furry fandom,
Mhm.
and they were expressing their frustration to me that there was so many misnomers and rumors about how furry started. And I was like, well, how about we just find out and talk to everyone involved
Okay.
before they're gone, and let's figure out what we can do to correct that problem.
Sure. How
Yeah.
much did you know about the community before you dove into this?
Well, so we are both furries.
Okay.
I was brought into the community by Phil when we first met. It was it's kind of been a part of our relationship in a sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had always been creating my own sort of cartoon characters as a kid, because kids love cartoons, and I kind of wanted them to be more than just a 30-minute thing. I wanted them to have more of a backstory and thought processes and representation of
Mhm.
different aspects of personality. And that's kind of what brought me into furry, is I wanted to expand on the idea of cartoon characters.
And then kind of to tie into that, what my big draw was how it played with identity,
Sure.
specifically how you could experiment with it. And being trans myself,
Mhm.
that of course is a really big thing. And interestingly enough, our the furry fandom has an incredibly rich history with the trans community. I mean, something like 14% of furries are trans,
Wow.
which is ridiculously huge when you consider, like normally in the outside world, that's a significantly less of a percentage, right? It's like I think it's like less than a percent of a percent.
Sure.
Uh, yeah.
You the documentary is very comprehensive, talking about the roots, but can you just sort of briefly chart the roots of the community to when it began and to how it is now and is more mainstream now? A little bit more.
Sure. So the fandom really began in the mid 1970s
Okay.
as fans of animation who loved anthropomorphic characters. So think like Kimba the White Lion and some of those early pieces that came out, early Disney pieces like Robin Hood would
Hmm.
be another example.
Yeah. Animal Olympics was a big one.
Yeah, Animal Olympics was a big one, and these people were just really big fans of these characters, and so they started to create little groups. One of these groups began down in Southern California, Garden Grove, and it really kind of started out as this merger between anime fans and people that liked these anthropomorphic characters. So, like these were people that were just pirating anime from Japan at
Sure.
that time, pirating it,
Okay.
basically signal jumping it from Hawaii to Southern California, recording it on old tapes, and then playing it for a group of people.
Wow.
And they would play it at sci-fi cons and anime cons, and I think it got so prolific that they asked the furries to basically start their own community.
Yeah, then they started conventions in the mid to late 80s, and it just exploded from there. There, mhm.
Jessica, go. Please finish.
Oh, there's just so much of a LGBT component to the community too. It seemed to attract that kind of individual.
Yeah, well, you create your own identity when you become furry, and of course that lends itself to exploring your identity and more about your own sexuality and how you present yourself.
Yeah.
What was the first time like when you went to a convention and surrounded by other people, who was part of the community as well?
So for me, that would have been, let's see, I think the first time I went to a convention would have been 2007. And it was this tiny little convention up in Denver. It was the first year they had it. I think there
Yeah.
was a couple hundred people, and I mean it was kind of goofy and silly and weird because like it's your first time being
Sure.
in that space, but I kind of immediately fell in love with it.
Yeah, I felt a little awkward around the costumes, to be honest, at first, because back then there was a lot of uncanny valley type stuff because costuming hadn't been mainstream or professional
Exactly.
anyway, and I did enjoy the part where you kind of felt like, oh, I can just be myself and not worry about if I'm awkward or not cool enough or weird. Everyone's like that, and we're all kind of the same. It felt really good.
It does. Yeah, I mean like that's kind of the magic of the community is it has this beautiful degree of acceptance. You're not looking at people at face value, like that superficial self. You're looking at somebody as they would like to be, and it's because of that element of imagination that carries you there
Mhm.
that really kind of pushes it through as the through line of this whole story.
Can you talk a little bit, as you mentioned, both mentioned, this community is very much an LGBTQ haven. Can you maybe offer an explanation of why, there's so many people who identify as part of the LGBTQ community who are part of this?
I mean, I think a lot of it actually has to do with this idea of creating, your own character. You start to ask yourself questions, like what would my ideal self be? Or, like as this character. And sometimes that might force you to question, your identity in certain ways. For me, it caused or it kind of really planted the seed of understanding myself
Hmm.
as a trans woman. I mean, I had this moment where I was like, well, actually, I kind of feel like my character is more of a girl,
Sure.
and I started to transition my character,
It's
and
it's kind of a way to experiment.
yeah,
You can experiment with your character first, and then you can do it in real life.
yeah, and as you start to find that comfort and happiness behind this veil of anonymity, which is
Okay.
like this character, right? You start to realize that you can have that yourself, that that's a
Sure.
fully attainable thing, and you just kind of fall into it. It's magical.
And the other part is a lot of people focus outside the furry community. There's a lot of focus on how you look physically, right? And furry kind of strips that physical aspect away. You don't
Okay.
have to have the perfect body. You don't have to pass necessarily. Your character can do that for you, and you can slowly attain what you want to be in real life. But
Okay.
you don't have to immediately be that perfect looking person.
Yeah.
Do you find that when people come to conventions for the first time, do you think there's a little bit of apprehension, nervousness about fully being themselves? And or I mean, for first timers, how would you describe how they're feeling? I mean,
Oh, well, first I got to say yes.
okay.
Absolutely. There is a high degree of apprehension whenever
Yeah,
somebody first goes to convention because it's kind of, I mean, it's like the first time, like maybe that you go to a gay bar or a place where you are
exactly.
more out and yourself.
Yeah.
You're kind of questioning that environment you're in.
And you can see that in the chat rooms. People are like, what should I expect? What should I do? What should I be? What should I dress like? You know, am I going to have anybody to talk to there? And it's a lot like your first experience at a gay bar.
Yeah.
You're just not sure what to expect. And then once you're there once, it's not so bad.
You realize that people don't really judge you there. And that
Exactly.
you can just kind of like be yourself, and you can always see the first timers, like the first day they're a little reserved, and then their guard just starts going down, like,
Yeah,
and by the last day they're up on stage dancing or something,
yeah,
like.
it's an amazing arc you can watch for first timers. Is they'll be checking their hair and dressing super nice, and by the third day they're just wild and partying and talking to everyone.
Obviously, a lot has changed since the 70s. One of the bigger
Uh-huh.
ways, a lot has changed. One of the bigger ways, obviously, is the internet. Can you
Mhm.
talk about how the internet has brought the community closer together?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's funny because there's this there's this consensus among furries. Furries
Mhm.
kind of run the internet in a weird
Okay.
way, like as in they've been instrumental from the very beginning,
Sure.
and a lot of kind of proliferations of forums and art sites.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the development of a lot of the core parts of the internet had furries involved at some point.
yeah. I mean, Carnegie Mellon was the site of the first furry muck, which was this kind of like online multiplayer environment. Think
Mhm.
like Dungeons and Dragons, except kind of it's all like text based
But
on
it was Carnegie Mellon was developing the first parts of the internet there,
yeah, at
and
that time.
they simultaneously had furry roleplay.
Yeah, like at that point, it's so like kind of from the inception, furries have been a part of it, but I think that as soon as that kind of globalized communication became much more of a staple,
Okay.
it expanded indefinitely because it really speaks to kind of this generation of individuals.
And before
Yeah,
the internet, furries had their own paper version of a forum,
Okay.
uh, with
yeah,
these zines they would pass around, self-published books, and people were on waiting lists to get in these self-published books so they could start writing to other furries in those books and pass them around the whole group. And these books got so popular they just couldn't maintain them, and they ended up being massively thick, like this
Yeah.
thick, and it was just all furries replying to each other and writing to each other, and it was ridiculous. So the pieces were already there before the internet, and the internet just made it blow up.
it's really funny actually looking back in those in those zines. You'll actually see what is essentially like the equivalent of a paper archive of people's chats with each other. So like
And
there's like pages,
and
literal
there's
pages
the
dedicated to this.
same kind of arguments that you see on the internet but on paper, like
Yeah, so
people fighting over if LGBTs are too promiscuous or aren't presenting themselves in the correct way, and those fights happen back on paper in the 70s, and you see the same thing happen now.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and it certainly is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so there's good and bad, but overall it just made it bigger.
Going from different conventions, would you say that costumes and characters are the same, or are there variations from convention to convention in terms of costumes and characters?
Well, I think costumes and characters are kind of an ever evolving thing
Sure.
because anytime somebody joins a fandom, they create a persona. A
Okay.
persona is essentially the animal representation of their self.
Hmm.
And so those characters are basically each individual that attends the convention has their own character. And then in regards to the like the costumes themselves, I mean, those tend to be well, they're giant wearable pieces of art.
Hmm.
So it takes obviously time and money to produce them.
Yeah.
I think as of right now, the average wait for a fursuit is about 2.5 years.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah,
I mean, we waited 4 or 5 years for ours.
yeah,
The interesting part with fursuits is that you get new fursuit makers coming in over time, and they'll start new style trends. So suddenly, this style of fursuit is more popular than what we had a couple years ago, and then other fursuit makers will add on to that, change it, improve it, and it's ever shifting art, and
Sure.
it's kind of amazing.
I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's the coolest part of the fandom, really, is that it is a community run by artists, like literally run from the top down by artists.
Yeah.
And those
Yeah.
artists and creators just pour their lives into this and their love, and it makes it this beautiful thing.
And to join, you really have to create some kind of character, which is itself an art, and then you
Yeah.
get
Certainly.
physical mediums to represent it, whether it's writing, uh, drawings, paintings, or costumes.
Yeah.
How long did it take each of you to come up with your own persona?
Oof. That's a good
I think it's
question.
an evolution.
It is an
Yeah.
evolution. So I
Okay.
mean, I'll let you start since you've been in longer than I have.
Yeah, my character has been fairly consistent with just small changes over time.
Okay.
I think 20 years ago, I had a couple markings that weren't there that are there now. But it was just slow changes to add to my character to make it more me.
Okay.
And some people switch species, some people create entire like groups of characters to represent different personality points.
Sure.
Yeah. So for me, when I first joined, I had identified as male, and I created this character that, in a lot of ways, was a projection of what I thought society wanted me to be.
Hmm.
Like it's an idealized form. And as I started to discover myself more, I slowly but surely transitioned my character to someone that is me, because it just didn't, like it's one of those things where it just doesn't feel like it fits. And you're like, why am I still pretending? What's the point? None of these people really care. And like, that's that's the funny thing about it, actually.
Yeah,
So Phil and I have been together for oh goodness, it's been about 12 or 13 years now.
yeah.
And so like he's been with me through my transition.
Hmm.
We started our relationship as a gay couple. We got gay married, and then we got straight married, which was a weird thing in Colorado. When you transition, apparently, it kind of invalidates your old marriage certificate. So we had to go back to the
Okay.
courthouse and
At
redo it
least
all.
at the time.
Um,
I don't know if that's the
yeah,
case anymore, but
yeah. So that was kind of
yeah.
silly, but like there's that dynamic kind of ever present within it. And I think in a lot of ways, that also helped us
Mhm.
when I was going through that period.
Yeah, and it was just really cool to see you slowly adopt different aspects of this new personality and new character, and then you manifesting that in real life over time.
Yeah.
So, how did you go about determining what subjects you were going to use for the documentary?
So a lot of this was a lot of this came down to trying to go through a discovery process of the individuals that were actually present at that time. And mind
Okay.
you, a lot of the history here isn't written. It's it's all kind of like hidden away in these like different corners of the internet and in zines and other
Yeah, I
publications
mean,
that
we kind of looked at, okay, who are the main figures in these letters that were being passed around? Who are the main figures in the archival footage? Um,
Yeah.
and
And like on the forums, for example, when we
yeah,
were kind of digging through some of the old internet
and
archives.
there were
Okay.
people there that we talked to that thought they might have known more, but may not have actually known the true story. So we had to be really careful not to feature people that might have been giving misinformation.
Yeah, and that is the difficulty when trying to, like do anything on a historical level, especially about a community
Yeah.
that
Exactly.
its documentation at that time period is incredibly sparse.
So it
Okay.
was a trail
Yeah.
of research to see who the key figures really were.
Yeah, I've literal like 7 notebooks down in my
Oh,
basement just of like research notes and like attaching different
sure.
individuals to different events and then
And
like
lots of
yeah.
note cards and
Yeah.
bulletin boards and
Yeah, it was a process, but I mean, when we did finally land on the core cast of characters, we had found folks that we had established
Hmm.
that have been there through these times and events, and that
Okay.
we were able to, like link back through
Okay.
everything. Yeah,
and we had to make sure they were also somewhat engaging. We couldn't just
Okay.
interview everyone. We wanted to include everyone, but some people had a better way of telling the story.
yeah.
Okay. So can you discuss a little bit your roles? I mean, obviously, Ash, you're the director. Phil, you're the producer. What did producing this entail?
So producing this entailed quite a bit of being an everything kind of person
Okay.
with our tiny team. Not only did I have to keep our story on track, being like, maybe we have missed out on this section and we need more of this section,
Okay.
but we also had to, manage our scheduling, our flights, who we were going to talk to and when, and
Hmm.
coordinating all the interviewees' schedules. Because part of it was just us going on a road trip together, driving through the West Coast. And we had to make sure everyone was available. And so I
Sure.
had to make sure people had meals. Even the people we were interviewing were fed. People we were working with had everything they needed.
Yeah, this was the characteristic low budget indie. I mean,
Yeah,
like
this
Okay.
was,
we
yeah.
we had a core team of 3 people. So it was myself, Phil, and our co-director and editor, Eric. And so between the 3 of us,
Yeah.
we made this film.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a lot.
it is a
It
lot.
sounds
So
like a lot. Yeah.
really kind of like my role as director started in with trying to fill out the history of the community as accurately as I could, and go through all the information and figure out the story points that I wanted to kind of follow and track. I realized pretty early on that we would need to kind of blend the archival with contemporary, or with the contemporary community, which is why you
Hmm.
see those kind of 2 storylines that play together. Because what the fandom was and what the fandom is today are 2 drastically different things. And so we would often find kind of contrasting points of view in the
Hmm.
modern community that might not have been in place back then. And we tried our best to really lay this out in a fashion that just accurately presented the community as it is,
Okay.
and as it was.
Sure. You just mentioned that, um, what the fandom was then versus what it is now. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean, like I would say that in its early days, at its point of inception, I mean, it was a certain group of individuals, like it was kind of AV geeks,
Hmm.
folks who loved animation and just fell in love with the idea of these characters. And I think in an evolutionary sense, we start to see that kind of through the 80s and 90s, it becomes increasingly more LGBT driven, increasingly more younger populaces with a kind of like college age bias is what I would say. During the 90s, for example, it shifted almost completely male. It was significantly
Yeah.
more men than women, and now it's actually dividing down more into what we would consider like a 50-50
Okay.
Yeah. It's
split.
approaching that.
Yeah,
And earlier on, because it was animation AV geeks, there's almost no costumes.
yeah, yeah. So costumes, you really see the explosion of fursuits, those furry costumes happen more in the 2000s. So all of that period through the 90s, the costumes were there, but they weren't as present as they are now.
Yeah,
Okay.
now everybody thinks furries are the costumes.
Yes. Yeah.
If I read correctly, if I remember correctly, I think, didn't you make 2 documentaries?
Yes,
And you have another one.
and I have a 5-part docu-series coming out soon too. But yeah, I never stop working. That's my thing. So we made the
Sounds like it.
Fandom, which is the history of the community. And then we also made this film called Hero, which is the
Yeah.
story of a young man who's dealing with a terminal cancer diagnosis and also waiting on their first fursuit. Um, that was a really beautiful and healing piece for me. Just before we released the Fandom during COVID, my grandfather passed away from cancer, and we had been reached out to because of the film by a local suit maker who told me the story of Hero, which the film is called Hero.
He said Hero was a big fan of yours.
Yeah, and I had this moment where I realized that I think that, like I just need to do this, and this is a part of my own healing process as an artist. And I mean, we went out there and documented the full creation of the suit in the span of a week, because this guy was insane and decided to make one over the course of a week. I mean, these things usually take months to create. And like Hero drove out and got to see the suit firsthand in person from the maker, and it was this incredibly beautiful moment. And that was more a little passion project.
Okay. I have to ask you, we were talking earlier before we started this, that when you came out as a trans filmmaker, it affected your career. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I mean, so I live in Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs is a relatively conservative environment.
Sure.
A lot of my clients that I would work with as a director of photography tended to have much more of a right-wing and religious skew to them.
Okay.
And so when I publicly came out as trans, and I started HRT, there was this funny correlation that happened, right? Suddenly you stop getting callbacks. Suddenly people stop bringing you out on jobs, and it got to a point where I was only getting work once every few months, and as a filmmaker that doesn't really work out. Of course, especially if you have like piles of gear and like expensive investments that you've made over the years to kind of foster a business. And I at that point decided to shut it down.
Right.
And
it took you a few years to feel like getting back into the industry because it hurt you so bad.
Yeah, I mean, that was very profound as far as my own ability to kind of find my voice. And I mean, I think, like you ask a lot of filmmakers, like everybody's like, oh, I want to be a director or something like that. And, like I'd always wanted to be a DP, and I had been working as a DP. And after going through that experience, I realized that like this is something that I wanted to talk about more and explore more. And it really kind of forced my voice as a filmmaker to come out. I mean, like by coming out as yourself, like you of course,
you had to create your own work.
Yeah, suddenly you feel the need to really express that on a larger level, and that is what ultimately kind of led us into the Fandom.
Okay.
And my current project that I'm working on as well.
Okay. Can you, it sounds like you two have mastered the art of being together personally, but also professionally. Can you talk about how that works and how you manage to live together and work together?
Sure. Well, I will let you start.
Oh, man. Okay. Well, yeah, we definitely like to talk about ideas and what we want to make all the time. Like I really want to tell this story and show this aspect. And then once we start getting into it, it does get hard. Especially when we have 18-hour days of shooting or something like that. It's exhausting, it's hard. Sometimes we don't always agree on everything. And we kind of have to talk it out or argue it out a little bit to figure out which direction we want to go with certain decisions.
I mean, I would say that we're both relatively stubborn individuals.
We're pretty stubborn.
And that's kind of always been this thing, is that we both have like this bullheaded determination to do, you know, like to do what we set out to do. And I've always had a passion for storytelling, and when we're working together, more often than not, you know, like Phil acts as kind of like a lightning rod for my creative chaos. And so I will be out there and I'm like, oh, you know, like we should really do this, and this. And Phil's like, do you really need to do that? And sometimes, you know, like you do have that moment where you have a little bit of conflict, but
yeah, because I'm more of like, okay, what can we practically get done during this time? And that's kind of why I'm the producer, is because what can we fit in our budget? What can we fit in our schedule? What can we actually make happen?
Yeah.
And it's hard because we want to make it all.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just not feasible. And I think that that's that reality check moment that is so crucial.
Yeah.
It's incredibly crucial to the process, though, in order to, you know, I think be an effective creator in any sense. You actually have to have a balance between, you know, like idealism and realism.
And that comes down to equipment sometimes. It's like, can we really afford another light?
Yeah. Or
should we get by with a smaller light for now?
Or should we be spending X amount of dollars on animation? Or, you know, like, like, as you know, like all that stuff adds up. And, you know, for me, I'm much more just like, yeah, let's do it.
But I love finding solutions to problems. I like fixing things. And so I kind of, once we get done like discussing the problem, I can sit down and think about, hey, how can I solve this in a way that gets Ash what she wants?
Exactly. All right.
Yeah, and that's really what is the key there, is finding whatever solution I can get her to make it.
Also, at the end of the day, don't be mad at each other. You know, like this is a film production. You know, like we're going into this with a unified goal, but at the end of the day, we drop that and we, you know, like we are us.
Yeah.
All right.
Also, eat and sleep.
Yeah, eat and sleep. Don't get hangry. You know, like that actually happens a lot.
So, final question: can you talk a little bit about your future projects, or the future project, and the future of this film, of the documentary?
Oh, sure. So, so we're first, I guess, let's talk about like future projects. So, currently, I am working on a 5-part docuseries on the Tenacious Unicorn Ranch. It is a trans anarchist alpaca ranch commune set in the gorgeous Rocky Mountains of Colorado. They were recently kind of put under siege by far-right militia. I happened to be filming there. I originally set out to make the film about queer people in the mountains. And it turned into something that was much more timely, I would say.
The national news story, basically.
Yeah, it was certainly interesting. So that's my current project that we're kind of in post-production on at the moment.
Yes.
As far as the future of the fandom goes, we were able to, through a lot of luck, secure distribution.
Oh, great. Congratulations.
Yeah, and we were able to get it out there a little bit more, so it's available on some streaming platforms.
Nice.
At the moment. But that's kind of the future of the fandom. I do hope to revisit it, you know, at some point, because I like docuseries as a medium, and I always feel like there's more to be told. So like it's kind of a fun, you know, like if I were to reapproach it.
We've had offers.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll come back to it.
Yeah.
Well, great. The documentary is The Fandom. Thank you, Ash. Thank you, Phil, for presenting this film to us, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us about it. We look forward to seeing what you all do next.
Thank you so much for having us to be a part of this. It's an honor.
So much. Yeah. Y'all have a great rest of the day.
All right,
Thanks so
bye.
much.
Bye.